The root of all kinds of evil, a fable. April is when the pilgrims come. They swarm from all directions, across the river out of the city from the north, across the chalk hills from the southwest, or down the river from the limestone colleges of the university. Only the eastern sea fails to fill the common room with them, and we even get one or two from there. And then they all leave together, riding out on the 90-mile journey to Canterbury to pay their respects to the old murdered archbishop, just as the lilac blossoms burst out across the city. I've been running the Tabard Inn since my father died, and pilgrimage season is my favourite time of year. Drunks, outlaws and ladies of the night, we see them all year round, and they change little from one month to the next. If you've met one of them, you've met them all. But pilgrims come from all walks of life, rich or poor, proud or humble, saint or sinner. I've met lawyers and sailors, monks and nuns, knights and cooks, doctors and squires. I once met a woman who proudly boasted of her 5 rich husbands, all dead. I politely declined her offer to buy me a drink. Most of the pilgrims are good, kind people. Many are hoping that the late St. Thomas Becket will perform a miracle for them. They are going blind or deaf or lame, or they have some other more private ailment. Some want only to pay their respects to the man who stood up to a king. Some have found in their pilgrimage a good excuse for a trip and have a slight tendency to forget their supposed goal in their excitement in the journey. But most are friendly, polite, and enjoy each other's company. They sit in the common room of an evening, telling tales and sharing their stories, and I listen, gathering tales from far and wide with pleasure. The pardoner, however, was an exception to the general rule. I knew as soon as he stooped under the door frame that he was a charlatan and a troublemaker. His weird, bug-like eyes, sat in a sunken face, gave him an unnerving appearance. He wore a rich red robe, but his flaxen hair hung over it in limp strands, unbound by any kind of hood. Instead, he wore a red felt hat with a high front brim, onto which he had stitched a piece of cloth with an image of the face of Jesus on it to resemble the veil of St. Veronica, and to show to everyone that he had but recently returned from Rome. He was carrying a little bag that was stuffed full of pardons from the Pope himself, or so he said. He had a slightly bigger bag too, the contents of which he pulled out and started to flourish in the faces of anyone trying to enter the common room, always ready to make a sale. "Relics!" he squeaked out in a voice like a screeching goat, shouting over the hustle and bustle of the evening rush as if he were selling cabbages in the marketplace. He jumped up onto a chair so that he could look out over the heads of his audience and draw the attention of everyone in the common room. "Relics, direct from the great holy city of Rome itself! Look!" With mock reverence, he pulled another piece of cloth from the bigger bag, this one dyed blue. "This was cut from the veil of Our Lady Mary, Mother of Christ herself!" A small crowd gathered around him. Some sniffed and turned up their noses at the veil, which I have to say was remarkably bright-coloured and well-preserved for a 1400-year-old piece of clothing, even allowing for it having belonged to the Mother of God. But others appeared genuinely impressed, and this encouraged the pardoner to continue. "And see here," he cried, holding up a dirty piece of canvas. "This is part of the sail from St. Peter's fishing boat." "Smells like it," cried a voice from the back of the room. "Has it been washed in the last 1,000 years?" This was followed by raucous laughter from one of the tables near the bar, whose occupants had been drinking since lunchtime. Some of his relics seemed more like the magical tokens of cunning folk. He had a mitten that he claimed would multiply the grain of the man that wore it, and a sheep's shoulder bone that he said, if dipped in a well, would cure just about any ailment in an animal or jealousy in a man. The pardoner's next relic was a bit less impressive, as he had to explain it. It was a small jar, at the bottom of which sat a sad little pile of even smaller bones. The pardoner claimed they were pig's bones, though if that were the case, it was a tiny little piglet that had sacrificed its life for his trade. "You remember the story of the man possessed by demons, and our Lord Jesus sent the demons into a herd of pigs who ran into the river and were drowned," he said. The crowd around him nodded in mild confusion. "Well, this was one of the pigs!" he cried out triumphantly to a series of deflated ohs. Sensing he was losing them, the pardoner next impressed his audience with a glossy, ornate-looking crucifix made of brass and studded with jewels. Then he pulled out his pièce de résistance, the pardons themselves. All bearing what he assured us was the papal seal, he had on his little scraps of vellum pardons for the sins of adultery, theft, blasphemy, covetousness. All the 10 Commandments were represented, along with 1 or 2 very expensive scripts that promised eternal salvation no matter what the buyer might do on earth. "I have no money for this sort of indulgence," cried one of the other pilgrims, a miller, laughing. "It would be cheaper by far not to sin in the first place." "Ah," said the pardoner, with an undeserved air of wisdom, "but the love of money is, as you know, the root of all kinds of evil. Let me tell you a tale." I leaned over the bar to listen, and the crowd settled around him, full mugs in their hands, to hear what he had to say. "Once upon a time," began the pardoner, "in Flanders, in the time of the plague, 3 friends were drinking in their local tavern." He paused to look around at all of us, beer and wine in our hands, sat around the table of the tabard, and then continued. "They were young, these 3, and reckless. Gilbert was the oldest of them, a burly youth with thick, dark, curly hair. William was slightly younger and slightly scrawnier, with mousy brown hair. The youngest was Oswald, whose hair was pale yellow, and who was the scrawniest of them all. The 3 of them wanted to do nothing but drink, play, dice, dance, and debauch themselves. And not just in the evening after a long day's work. These 3 were sitting around on their backsides having a drink before the morning bell had rung. As they were draining their cups, they heard a handbell ringing just outside the door and poked their noses out to see what it was. A funeral was going by, 6 black-clad men carrying a 7th on a bier, followed by a procession of black-hooded men and a few women. Another victim of the plague? Gilbert asked the tavern boy as they returned to their seats. No, sir, the boy replied. This was a friend of yours, Henry the cobbler, who has drunk and gamed with you here for many a long night. He was here last night, lying across that bench over there, and the boy pointed across the room. As he was drinking, I saw a man come in from the cold, at least it looked like a man. He was tall, and his face was shrouded in a black cloak, and he carried a scythe, which I thought was strange at that time of night. He walked right up to your friend Henry there, and out of nowhere, quick as you like, he stuck the point of his scythe right into poor Henry's heart. Before any of us could move, he turned around with a sweep of his cloak and walked out again into the night. Death, gasped William in horror. It was death. Oswald nodded. He's killed 1,000 people in this plague already. He killed an entire village over the way last week, added the tavern's landlord. Men, women, serfs, pages, children, all gone, just like that. In God's name, this cannot be borne, declared Gilbert, suddenly shouting and slamming his empty tankard down on the table. How many more are we to lose? Is there anyone here has not lost their nearest and dearest loved ones to this monster, death? All of them, William, Oswald, the tavern boy, and the landlord, shook their heads sadly. William put his hand to a small badge that once belonged to his sister. Oswald felt the necklace that had been his mother's underneath his shirt. Well, I say, no more, cried Gilbert, his words slurring as they poured out of his mouth. Come on, men, let's put an end to this. Let us go and kill death. William and Oswald cheered, and they too drained their mugs, and all 3 men rolled out into the early sunshine, lurching off down the road towards the empty village in search of death. About halfway there, they were about to cross a stile when they saw a pitiful figure slowly making its way towards them. It was an old man, a very old man, more shriveled and wrinkled and bent over with age than any man they had ever seen. His clothes were in rags, barely held up by a rope belt, though over them he had wrapped a long and tattered cloak that swayed around him in the wind, and as he walked he leaned on a knobbed wooden staff. They stood back to let him cross the stile, and watched as he slowly and painfully pulled himself up one side, creaked his bones as he rolled over the top, and tenderly let himself down again in front of them. Good luck to you, my lords, and give you quiet, said the old man politely, straining his back to stand up and look at them. Old fool, snorted Gilbert contemptuously. You should give way to us, not us to you. Why are you still wandering at your great age? Isn't it time for you to die? Why live so long? Because, rasped the old man hoarsely, I have never yet found anyone willing to take on my age in exchange for his own youth and give me back my mortality. I have searched the whole world over. I have walked to India and back and stopped at every village and town on the way. But not one person can I find who will make the bargain. And so God has ordained I must continue to walk, and not even death can take my life. Death, cried William. It is death we are seeking, old man. He may not want you, but he has taken dozens of our friends and our kin these past few weeks. Where is he? We 3 are going to find him and put an end to him. You are so old and seem to know him, added Gilbert. I think you are his spy. Where is he? The old man seemed to think for a moment, and a sly smile spread across his face. Do you know, he said slowly, I think I did see him today. He was resting after a long night, he told me, taking some of the youngest and fittest souls in the country. He had laid down his scythe and stopped to rest under that old oak tree over there. Do you see? The biggest tree in that little grove down the hill. I think you'll find him still sleeping there, or if not, he won't be far away. The 3 drunkards leapt over the stile and cantered down the hill without another word or a second glance. The old man gave a single deep sigh, gathered his worn-out cloak around himself, and plodded on. As they neared the tree, the three friends stopped, for they could see something lying in a pile, dumped among the gnarly roots that spread out across the ground under the summer leaves of the oak. Whatever it was, it glinted in the sunlight that darted down through the branches. "My God!" cried Oswald, eyes wide. "It's gold!" And gold it was, a huge pile of gold florins, 8 bushels worth by the looks of it. All thoughts of death were forgotten. All three friends ran towards the hoard of treasure, picking up the coins and running them through their fingers for the sheer joy of it. "This is too much to bring home all at once in just our pockets," said Gilbert thoughtfully. "And besides, if anyone on the road sees the three of us in our work clothes carrying this much money in broad daylight, why, they'll take us for robbers for sure. We must wait here until nightfall and take it away under the cover of darkness." William and Oswald nodded and agreed to the wisdom of this. "So," continued Gilbert, watching their faces carefully, "we will need to sit here and guard this treasure until nightfall. But it is summer, and the days are long, and we have barely eaten." "I am starting to get a headache," put in Oswald glumly. "Exactly. So what I propose is this. We will draw lots, and whoever draws the longest stick, he will be the lucky one. He will run into town to fetch money bags, and bread, and wine for all three of us to eat and drink on this spot while we wait for nightfall." All three agreed that this was a good plan, so they gathered up some sticks from beneath the trees and drew lots. Oswald drew the longest stick and set off for the town straight away. Now Gilbert glanced towards William, and when Oswald was out of earshot, he said, "This is a great treasure, is it not?" And William agreed that it was. "It's only a shame," Gilbert continued, "that it has to be split 3 ways. Imagine if it were divided into only 2. It would be even greater still." "That's true, of course," said William, "but Oswald knows where it is and will be back before nightfall, and you have already explained yourself why we cannot simply carry it away now." "You know, Oswald is entertaining enough as a drinking companion," said Gilbert, "but I've never really considered him a close friend. Have you? After all, he can be quite whiny, and his voice has that terrible squeak to it. And he's just not quite like us, is he? We are brothers by sworn vow and by the love we hold for each other, if not by blood." "What are you getting at?" asked William. "All right, here's the plan," said Gilbert. "When Oswald comes back, you should challenge him to a wrestling match to pass the time. While you two are fighting, when he turns away from me, I'll plunge my dagger into his back. Then you stab him from the front, and there will be only 2 of us to share the treasure." Oswald returned a little while later, looking flushed and excited. His cheeks were red, his breath was shallow, and his eyes darted here and there as if he was nervous. He carried 3 large bags for transporting the money, 3 bottles of wine, a small package of bread and cheese, and a small box with an apothecary's mark on it that seemed to be empty. "Shall we all have a drink, then?" asked Oswald, before he had even sat down. "In a moment," said William. "You have had a good walk and stretched your legs, but we have been getting cramped perching on these old roots while we waited for you. I challenge you to a wrestling match. Just a quick one, and then we can all sit down for a drink." "All right, just quickly. I'm tired already," said Oswald. "Here," he added, pulling out the bottles of wine. "These are for you." He gave 2 of the bottles to his friends, storing the 3rd with his own belongings. William put the 2 bottles down by the tree, then he got up and grabbed his younger friend by the waist, pulling him around so that his back was exposed to Gilbert, who wasted no time at all. The older man plunged his dagger into young Oswald's back, soaking his hand and arm in fresh red blood. Young Oswald could not scream, for the breath had been driven out of his body by the blow, and William quickly drew his own dagger and finished the job by driving it directly into the young man's heart, his aim as true as that of Death himself the night before. Gilbert and William stood panting, staring down at what they had done. "We had better bury him," said William. "Later, when it's getting dark," said Gilbert. "We don't want anyone to spy us digging from the road and wonder what we're up to. Look, he brought food and wine. Let's sit down and eat and drink to celebrate our good fortune." He gestured towards the pile of gold florins, a few of them slightly stained with the blood that was slowly seeping across the ground towards them. William picked up the 2 bottles of wine that Oswald had given him, and he and Gilbert moved to the other side of the treasure and sat down with their backs to the bloody corpse. They each drank deep, and then broke the bread to share it with each other. But no sooner had they swallowed the bread than both of them vomited it straight back up again. They both felt a stabbing pain in their stomachs, their mouths started to foam, their heads swam, and before it was dark enough for them to carry out their plan, they both lay below the tree, stone dead. For Oswald had also thought about the pile of treasure, and how much bigger it would be if it were not divided at all. While he was in town, he had called in to see the apothecary, and told that worthy gentleman that the tavern was overrun with rats, and that he had offered to buy some poison to free them of the swarm. He had put the poison in 2 of the bottles of wine, keeping just 1 for himself. Those 2 he had given to William. And that is the end of the tale, and I hope you can all understand the moral clearly enough, for as the saint says, the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. So do not seek treasure for its own sake alone, or cling to your purses like a skinflint. Spend your money, if you have it, on something that will help you and enrich your life. A low murmur rose among the listeners, while a few called for more drinks. Several of them, unused to red wine rather than ale, were already slouching in their seats, their heads lolling. But others were alert and intrigued by what the pardoner had to sell. "Dearly beloved," he cried out, sensing he might be losing their attention now that his story was over. "May God forgive your sins and keep you safe from the sin of avarice. But fear not if you have fallen victim to this dreadful vice, for I have pardons here that will cleanse your soul, set you right with God, and spare you from the tortures of purgatory if you should die on your way home. I will take silver coins, rings, or silver brooches in payment." I shook my head, but I would have left it there if he had not decided at that moment to turn his attention to me. "Come now, barkeep," the oily man cried, suddenly raising his eyes to me and looking at me over the heads of the rest. "Of everyone here, you are surely the most completely wrapped up in sin, for you are here every night serving drunkards and ruffians and fallen women. Come, be the first to buy your salvation. Get over here and kiss my relics, and for just 1 little silver groat you will be reconciled to our Lord." This was too much. "Kiss your relics?" I cried. "Not likely. Next thing you'll have me kissing your breeches, claiming those are relics too. May the curse of Christ descend upon me if I fall for any of your tricks. If I had your balls in my hand, I'd cut them off and have them enshrined in a hog's turd, and then you'd really have a relic worth paying for." Raucous laughter filled the room as all heads turned to the pardoner, whose breeches were unfortunately at just eye height. Flushing bright red, he clambered down from the chair and gathered up his relics, his audience having entirely lost interest. Face pinched, he stalked over to the bar and hissed, "It is lucky for you that I am a man of God, sir." Then he spun on his heel and marched straight out of the tavern. My customers, satisfied that the show was over, spent their money on my wine instead, and I dare say got far more good from it than from a flap of old canvas or a hastily scrawled note from Rome. The end. Hello, welcome back to Creepy Classics, the podcast retelling ancient, medieval and early modern ghost stories, with new episodes out once a month. I'm Juliet, I'm a writer and historian. I originally specialised in ancient Rome, but I've branched out since. This month's story is from the Canterbury Tales. I studied The Wife of Bath's Tale for A-level many, many years ago, but I hadn't read any of the others, and The Wife of Bath's Tale the tale itself is a bit of Arthurian legend, which is quite fun. I love Arthurian legend, but it has this enormously long prologue, which we weren't terribly fascinated by when we were 17. So I hadn't really gone back to the Canterbury Tales, but they really are very much worth a read. And going to this one to retell it for the podcast, Chaucer is famous for a reason. He's a great writer. They're very funny. They're very kind of bawdy and silly and entertaining, and you really get a sense of this group of medieval characters, so I definitely recommend reading them. I was using a relatively old translation. I can just about read the Middle English if I really try, and I have a glossary, but it's a lot easier to read in a translation into modern English. This is a fairly old translation by Neville Coghill from Penguin Classics, but it's quite an old copy, but there are plenty of more up-to-date translations around, and it's all available online for free anyway. Geoffrey Chaucer lived from about 1343 to his death in 1400. He was a philosopher and a writer from London. He wrote several things, but his most famous work is definitely the Canterbury Tales. Canterbury Tales is a collection of stories, and the framing device is that the people telling the stories are pilgrims going to Canterbury to visit the shrine of St. Thomas Becket in Canterbury Cathedral. This was a very, very popular pilgrimage in the medieval period, in the 14th century. Chaucer himself had them start at the Tabard Inn in Southwark, which kept going till about the Victorian period. Unfortunately, it's not there anymore, but it was very much a real place and reasonably well known. So I set my story in the same place. I was going to set it in an inn in Canterbury, but Chaucer already set the opening of it anyway in an inn. The tales are told as the pilgrims ride the 90 miles to Canterbury from the inn. But instead of having the interaction with the host who gets them all to tell the stories, I had the interaction with the barman at the Tabard. I figured there's no need to change things that don't need changed. I'm making this hang together as a kind of self-contained short story rather than one of many stories, so that's why I kind of set it in the tavern and not kind of on the journey. But I obviously have references to the other stories in the references to the various types of pilgrim who come. Those are all characters who tell tales in the Canterbury Tales. And of course there's a reference to the wife of Bath in there, who was married 5 times and they all died. I seem to remember when I studied at A level the suggestion that was she killing off all these husbands was a genuine kind of point that we talked about. Chaucer's partner travels with a summoner. These are both men who basically make money from medieval religion. That's a weird way to phrase it. These are the sorts of people that Martin Luther was complaining about when he put up his 95 Theses in the early 16th century and kickstarted the Reformation. These are the people that were some of the huge problems with Roman Catholicism as it was practiced in the medieval period. A summoner's job was to deliver summons notices for people to appear in church courts, but they were known for extorting money from people under the threat of bringing them to court. Pardoners sold pardons. That is literally little, I've suggested probably vellum, little messages, slips of paper, whatever material they're written on, parchment, which would say, you're pardoned for this sin, or if they're really expensive, you're pardoned for any sin you might commit. And this is all to do with the medieval theology around heaven and hell and purgatory. You go straight to heaven if you have not committed any sins or you've bought one of these pardons. You go to hell if you've done anything really, really awful. And then most people, including people who've committed crimes like murder and assault and all sorts of things, it has to be really terrible to go straight to hell. Most people go to purgatory and then they are tortured for a period of time until they have worked off their sins. So buying a pardon reduces the time you are going to spend in purgatory. And the pardoners often also sold relics, or more likely fake relics, as this one does. And the medieval trade in relics was well known for including many, many fakes. Relics are kind of holy items associated with saints. They're often literally bits of the bodies of saints, saints' finger bones and things, although they can be other items associated with that particular saint, as we see here, canvas from St. Peter's fishing boat and stuff like that. There were an enormous number of fake relics around in the medieval period. There were some great jokes about that in the first Blackadder series, about enough pieces of the Holy Cross to build several new crosses and things like that. So the pardoner is getting money from people by selling fakes. He's, not a moral person. What he does is tell a very moral story about how greed is bad, but he does it because he wants people to be willing to part with their money to buy his stuff, and also to make himself seem more holy. I've given the story the title, The Root of All Kinds of Evil, which is a quote from, I'm pretty sure, one of St. Paul's letters. I honestly can't remember off the top of my head which one. It's either one of the Gospels or one of St. Paul's letters. I think it's one of St. Paul's letters. It's often quoted as, money is the root of all evil, but the Greek is more, money is the root of all kinds of evil, as in lots of different types of evil come from the love of money. Sorry, it's the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, not money itself. This is part of the misquoting. So it's often misquoted as like money itself is the root of every evil in the world, which it may feel like sometimes. But the quote is more accurately, the love of money, rather than the money itself, is the root of lots of different types of evil, but not every type of evil there is. So I took that as my title. The title of the story in the Canterbury Tales is, of course, just The Pardoner's Tale, because that's how all of these stories are titled. They're just titled by the character who tells the story. Chaucer describes the pardoner as either a gelding or a mare. That means he's either a eunuch or a fairly effeminate gay man. I didn't particularly want to include medieval homophobia in my version, so I've kept kind of most of the description of the pardoner. I just left out the explicit kind of, I think he was probably gay, which just kind of comes across as a bit homophobic to kind of bring up. The pardoner has a bit of the veil of St. Veronica, supposedly, or an image of the veil of St. Veronica on his cap. Saint Veronica is a character in the story of the crucifixion of Jesus who wipes Jesus' face while he is carrying his cross to the place of execution, and then the image of his face stays on the veil that she has used to wipe it. And among the many, many relics and fake relics that were around in the medieval period, there were lots and lots and lots of veils of Saint Veronica, pieces of material with a face that's meant to be the face of Jesus on it. So this is another indication of the pardoner's tendency to sell fake relics, basically. In adapting the pardoner's tale, I have chopped it down quite a bit, streamlined it. It is part of the pardoner's character that he goes off on one with moralising as part of the story, but that just isn't the most exciting thing to read, and it's also absolutely stuffed full of classical references that I get now, but I didn't get when I first read the Canterbury Tales as a teenager, and you have to kind of stop and read a footnote every 5 minutes if you haven't done a ton of classical and ancient history, so I left out a lot of those. I had to give the characters names because it's a fable, it's not meant to be a realistic story. The 3 drunkards don't have names. This is like, the tale of the 3 princes, the 3 living and the 3 dead people, which is another medieval tale. The characters don't usually have names in these things, but in the interest of telling the story in a way that was going to flow a bit better and not just keep saying the other one, and the older one, and the younger one, and the most wicked one at one point, Chaucer describes one of them as, I gave them names. I used anglicised versions of Flemish names that I thought would work in either England or Flanders, because this tale is told in England by an Englishman, but set, in theory, in Flanders, in Europe, which is not very far from England. Similarly, the description of the funeral matches medieval funerals in England. It matches the description in Chaucer. I think funerals in Flanders and England in this period were probably very, very similar. And also, Chaucer and his audience are English. The story is a fable told by an English character, so I figured even if there were differences in funerals in Flanders, the character of the pardoner probably wouldn't really know that and would describe an English funeral anyway. The detail of why someone doesn't scream if they are stabbed in the back comes from the DVD extras on The Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King. This is the most amazing story Peter Jackson tells. There is a scene in the extended edition of The Return of the King where Sir Christopher Lee's character, Saruman, is stabbed in the back. And they were filming the scene, and Jackson was trying to tell Christopher Lee to, scream or something. And Christopher Lee goes, "Have you ever heard a man stabbed in the back?" And Peter Jackson's like, no. And Christopher Lee says, "I have." Christopher Lee was in the Special Services in World War II, and he did not elaborate further, but Christopher Lee was a badass. He knew what somebody sounded like when they are stabbed in the back. And when you are stabbed in the back, it does drive the breath out of your body and you don't scream. You just kind of make well, if you want to know what sound they make, watch the extended edition of Lord of the Rings, Return of the King, and you can hear it right there. The pilgrims in the Canterbury Tales are headed to the shrine of St. Thomas Becket in Canterbury Cathedral. Thomas Becket was the Archbishop of Canterbury in the 12th century. He lived from 1119 or 20 to 1170. He had been Lord Chancellor for King Henry II before he was made Archbishop of Canterbury. He was also a bishop and a clergyman. He and Henry fell out over a series of laws called the Clarendon Constitutions. These were changes to English law aimed at reducing the power of the Pope and the Catholic Church as opposed to the King. One example is that clergy accused of serious crimes were being tried by ecclesiastical courts rather than royal courts, and they were getting less severe penalties for these serious crimes. So Henry and Becket had fallen out over that. Then in June 1470, the Archbishop of York, the Bishop of London and the Bishop of Salisbury crowned the heir to the throne, Henry the Young King, at Westminster Abbey. This was Henry II's eldest son, also called Henry. He was supposed to succeed his father, and he had this coronation to make him the crown prince, basically, so that he would sort of share the rule with his father. Unfortunately, Henry died before his father, which is why we got Richard and then John, who are two of Henry's younger children. But at this point, Henry the Young King was still alive, and these other three, the Archbishop of York, Bishop of London, Bishop of Salisbury, had him crowned at Westminster Abbey instead of Canterbury, where kings had been being crowned, and without Becket. In November, Becket excommunicated all three of them. So that is, he declared that they were no longer members of the Catholic Church, and excommunication in medieval Catholicism is quite serious. Catholics aren't supposed to kind of let you in or feed you or let you stay with them. You know, it's quite a big deal to be excommunicated in the medieval period, and it's an even bigger deal if you are an archbishop or a bishop. The story goes that Henry then said something that was interpreted as him wanting Becket dead. The usual quote is that Henry cried out, possibly while drinking, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" This is a bit of oral history. We don't really know exactly what happened, and it does sound quite a lot like something Henry might have said afterwards. Maybe Henry ordered his death and then needed to get out of that, because you're not supposed to order the murder of archbishops. But anyway, this is the story, that Henry, frustrated and angry, cried out, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" not really meaning anything by it, but he was overheard by 4 knights who set out to Canterbury to kill Becket. They murdered him in the cathedral on the 29th December 1117. Now, this is obviously a horrific crime, not just because it's a murder, but because it's in the cathedral. In this period, churches are sanctuaries. You can run into a church and ask for sanctuary to avoid prosecution or, people chasing you, whatever it is. Churches are holy places, and you shouldn't be murdering people anywhere, but you absolutely should not be murdering people in the cathedral. Murdering an archbishop in a cathedral is about as bad a sin as you can get in this period and in this kind of Catholic context. So this was an absolutely horrifying crime. Henry had to do public penance and walk through the streets saying how sorry he was and flagellating himself and all sorts of things. It absolutely horrified everybody. And Becket, as a supporter of the church against the king, became a saint and was made a saint by the Catholic Church. And then people started making pilgrimages to his shrine, and he had miracles attributed to him and so on. Of all the Canterbury Tales, I chose this one to retell because obviously it features death. So I suppose technically it's not a ghost story, but it's a story with the personification of death in it. So seemed like that worked. But one of the most interesting characters in it is the old man, who could be a ghost, although that isn't necessarily implied, not in the way we might mean by ghost. Scholars have made various suggestions for the identity of the old man over the years, including that he is death himself, that he is a messenger for death, that he is a personification of the concept of old age, that he is a personification of the way St. Paul used the phrase old man in his letters. This would be ho palaios anthropos in Greek, or vetus homo in Latin. St. Paul uses the phrase to mean a kind of sinful pre-conversion self before conversion to Christianity. Obviously, St. Paul is a convert to Christianity, which is a bit different to the medieval period, where you become a new man. Some people have even suggested Noah or the Norse god Odin as the old man's identity. I think the most convincing suggestion is that he is meant to be the Wandering Jew. This was a medieval legend about a man who had angered God or Jesus, or, well, they are both the same person, in some way at the crucifixion, and had been cursed to wander the earth and not die until the second coming of Jesus. It's not a Jewish legend, it's a Christian legend about a character identified by Christians as Jewish. The figure is often associated with John the Evangelist, who would be Jewish, with Malchus, the soldier who hit Jesus, or with a servant of Pontius Pilate called Cataphilus. I have to say Malchus or Cataphilus would quite likely be Greek or Roman, although I suppose they might be Jewish. Medieval Christians didn't know the ancient context that deeply anyway. Some scholars have doubted this and said it's not really clear that the old man can't die. He just means that he's very old and he will die when God wills it. To me, I think this sounds like the Wandering Jew, because I think it sounds like the clear implication that Chaucer is making is that this old man cannot die. So to quote Chaucer's actual Pardoner's Tale, rather than my retelling, one of the young men, the rioters, says to the old man, "Why live so long? Isn't it time to die?" And Chaucer says, or the Pardoner says, "The old fellow looked him in the eye and said, 'Because I never yet have found, though I have walked to India, searching round village and city on my pilgrimage, one who would change his youth to have my age. And so my age is mine and must be still upon me for such time as God may will. And this relates to some variants of the Wandering Jew story, where he has to find someone who will swap their youth for his old age in order to die. So I think this old man is meant to be the Wandering Jew. That sounds like a pretty clear implication to me. The story is set during the time of the plague, which would be around the time Chaucer was a young child. The 14th century in England was a pretty terrible, terrible time. There was a great famine, 1315 to 1317. The country was in the middle of the 100 Years' War, which ran 1337 to 1453. And then you get the Black Death, which sweeps across Europe, starting in Eastern Europe in 1346, working its way to England by 1349, to Scotland by 1350, and then back over to northeastern Europe by 1353. And there are clear references to plague in this story. The plague had almost certainly arrived on fleas carried themselves by black rats, possibly from slave ships and traders from the east. There was also a drought in Asia and the rats were moving west. Caused between 7,500,000 and 2 million deaths globally, and killed about 30 to 60% of the population of Europe, including princes like the son of the Byzantine emperor. And this would all have been happening when Chaucer was a young child, but old enough that he would remember at least some of it, and certainly his parents would have talked about it. So in the middle of a tough century, this was an absolutely horrific plague that kind of affected European history for centuries. It had a huge, huge impact, and particularly in England and Wales and the British Isles, but particularly England and Wales, because they not only had the Great Famine not long before, but they're in the middle of the 100 Years' War as well. So it's a very hard time in England and Wales and in Europe in general. And you can see that in the story, the personification of death, the descriptions of death killing off entire villages, the idea of just death stalking the land. And I've given death a very kind of traditional appearance. Chaucer doesn't really describe death in his version, but I gave him your basic, I didn't say it was a skeleton, but, figure that's in a hood with a scythe. I just went with a very kind of typical European depiction of the figure of death. But that context of this horrific plague, I think, is where a lot of these stories come from, and lots of other medieval things like the dance of death that's often painted on churches, which has all these kind of dancing skeletons painted on the walls of churches in Britain and in Europe. Stories about death, ideas about death. It comes partly from this just horrific plague with this absolutely enormous death rate that has swept the continent. If you are interested in reading more about this, I used a few books in writing the story and researching the background. Medieval Folklore, A Guide to Myths, Legends, Tales, Beliefs and Customs by Carl Lindahl, John McNamara and John Lindow, particularly on the Wandering Jew. Death and Burial in Medieval England, 1066 to 1550 by Christopher Daniell. I used The Folklore of Discworld by Terry Pratchett and Jacqueline Simpson just to kind of confirm the depiction of death. I know what death looks like in the Discworld books very well. I was just checking that was actual medieval folklore, which it is. Doesn't surprise me. And I used The Time Traveller's Guide to Medieval England by Ian Mortimer for lots of little things about medieval life. Things like taverns in towns would sell red wine, where taverns in the countryside would more likely, or pubs in the countryside would more likely sell ale, and kind of lots of bits and pieces of just kind of everyday life in the medieval period from that one. I had a quick look at a website called schoolofmary.org for the Pauline theology on the old man, and then several academic articles that I accessed via JSTOR on theories about who the old man is. So Peter G. Beidler's Noah and the Old Man in the Pardoner's Tale in the Chaucer Review, Volume 15. Elizabeth R. Hatcher's Life Without Death, The Old Man in Chaucer's Pardoner's Tale in the Chaucer Review, Volume 9. And Alexandra Hennessy's They Shall Desire to Die and Death shall flee from him, a reconsideration of the Pardoner's Old Man in Neuphilologische Mitteilungen, Volume 84. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, do consider buying one of my books, Creepy Classics, Ghost Stories from Ancient Rome, Ghost Stories from Ancient Greece, and Haunting Tales for Winter. These are all collections of stories I've told on this podcast, but they all also include one story that is exclusive to the book. So if you've listened to every episode, there is an extra story in there if you buy the book. They're available in ebook or paperback from Kobo, also from Barnes & Noble and Amazon and Apple and Fable and all the places. So do check those out. I also have a new Patreon. Nearly forgot to say. Very exciting. I have a Patreon now. It's just Juliet Harrison's Patreon. I will be offering on the Patreon one extra story in written form each month, and it will be from the 19th or 20th centuries. On this podcast, I stop at about 1815. That's where I've decided to cut off the early modern period, and I'll cover pretty much anything up to there. But I don't do Victorian or 20th century ghost stories on this podcast, just because there's a lot of other places doing that. But what I will do is on the Patreon, there will be in a PDF a written short story retelling a 19th or 20th century ghost story, and also a dog walking video. Each month there will be a dog walking vlog on the Patreon. So do check that out and sign up if that sounds interesting. And obviously I'll put the link, all the various places that one puts links. Again, thank you so much for listening. I will be back again next month with probably another medieval ghost story. I'm putting together a collection of medieval ghost stories at the moment. So likely we'll be back in medieval Europe again next month. Creepy Classics is written and performed by Juliet Harrisson, music composed and performed by Ed Harrisson, and it's produced by Juliet Harrisson.